I was smiling when the year turned, not because I loved celebrations, but because a new year meant another cycle closed without a single regulatory fire to put out. I had a glass in my hand, a rare, quiet night, and the relief of knowing no one would call me before morning. Then my phone vibrated. An email sent by the HR department had the subject line Organizational Update. I opened it casually. The smile didn't last. Your position has been eliminated effective immediately. I reread the sentence, waiting for context to soften it. None came. The next line explained that my role was no longer aligned with the company's evolving governance model. A few words later, another reassurance appeared, polished and insulting in its precision. This action is not performance-related. Signed by Ryan Whitmore, our CEO. That was almost funny. My name is Felicia Grant, for 11 years. I served as Director of Corporate Integrity, which meant I was the person executives tolerated, not celebrated. I didn't chase growth, I chased consequences. I built internal controls, reviewed executive decisions before they crossed invisible lines, and made sure ambition didn't wander into criminal territory. When deals survived scrutiny, it was because I had already dismantled the risks no one wanted to discuss. Ryan Whitmore never liked that role. Ryan is our CEO, young, confident, and surgically efficient. He believes the law is a checklist, not a responsibility. To him, governance is useful only when it accelerates power. When it slows him down, it becomes excess weight. The email laid out the reason clearly. My department was being dissolved to accelerate decision-making velocity. Oversight would be absorbed at the executive level. Translation: the guardrails were gone, and everyone would pretend that made the road safer. The termination itself was flawless. Proper documentation, approved severance, clean legal language. It was executed on the final day of the fiscal year. When accountability feels abstract and most people are distracted, nothing about it violated policy. That was the point. I felt the irritation settle in, sharp and contained. Then I smiled. I replied with one word: acknowledged. I signed exactly where instructed. I didn't request a call. I didn't defend my record. Silence, in moments like that, carries weight. The final line sat alone at the bottom of the message, casual and confident, as if nothing important had been erased. Effective immediately. Happy New Year. How are you feeling right now? Moments like this have a way of hitting closer than we expect, especially at the start of a new year. I hope your path has been kinder than mine, and that this year brings you the respect you deserve. Tell me where you're listening from. And if this story speaks to you, stay with me and subscribe, because what happens next is where everything truly begins. By the second morning, irritation had settled into something heavier. Not grief, not regret, something colder. I logged into the public document archive, the one no termination could erase, and started searching. My name didn't appear, not once. Policies I had authored, reviewed, and defended for years now listed executive oversight as their owner. The language was familiar, but stripped. Precision replaced caution. Context vanished. It felt like watching my fingerprints wiped from glass while the object stayed exactly where it was. Then I noticed the ethics reports. They still existed, technically, but they had been simplified. Risk matrices flattened into bullet points, conditional warnings rewritten as suggestions. What used to read like a system of breaks now read like a suggestion box. I wasn't surprised. I was insulted. They hadn't just removed me. They had erased the memory of why I was needed. I remembered the nights I stayed awake, rewriting memos no one wanted to read, the emails sent after midnight, explaining why a shortcut would cost more than patience. I had blocked partnerships that smelled wrong, delayed product launches that leaned too hard on assumptions, and documented objections executives hoped would never resurface. Every time. Ryan smiled thinly and said, "You worry too much." Every time. I worried anyway. Ryan Whitmore likes power clean. He prefers decisions that leave no fingerprints and no witnesses. He jokes that ethics slow growth. says it in meetings like it's a clever insight. To him, integrity is a brand accessory, useful when investors are watching and inconvenient when velocity matters. He never argued with me directly. He waited. And now, without me, the waiting was over. I saw it buried in a board summary, a restructuring initiative Ryan had proposed last year. I had flagged it then, warned that the liability exposure was unacceptable. It required independent review. He withdrew it with a laugh. Now it was live. Approved, moving forward without hesitation. The safeguards I had insisted on were gone, replaced by optimism and confidence. The unfairness tightened my jaw. This wasn't incompetence, it was intent. They hadn't fired me to save money, they fired me to remove resistance. I closed the file and leaned back, feeling the anger coil but stay contained. Rage would be useless. Observation wouldn't. They hadn't improved anything, they had simply cleared the path. Betting no one would notice how exposed the company had suddenly become inside. Then I found the final detail. A footnote, barely referenced, confirming the dissolution of an independent ethics committee. It had existed quietly for years, rarely used, often ignored. Its mandate ended exactly 1 day after my termination email. That was the moment the irritation hardened into something permanent. I didn't expect the silence after what I discovered to last. After seeing policies rewritten, safeguards erased, and an ethics committee dissolved overnight, I assumed the next move would come from Ryan Whitmore himself. It didn't. Instead, the response came from a direction that bypassed him entirely. Margaret Whitmore is Ryan's mother. She has never held an executive title, never appeared in town halls, and never attached her name to operational decisions. Her influence lives inside the Whitmore Family Trust, where she serves as principal trustee, a role defined by distance rather than command. She doesn't manage people, she doesn't correct outcomes. She observes. What mattered was how she learned about me. Not from Ryan, not from legal, not from human resources. The news reached her through an old board liaison who still remembered what the company looked like before speed became a substitute for judgment. When Margaret heard my name, she didn't ask why I was terminated. She asked one question, only who is Felicia Grant? That question traveled back to me before she did. Her call arrived the following afternoon. No apology softened the opening. No explanation followed. She introduced herself, confirmed my identity, and asked if I would be willing to meet her for coffee later that week. She didn't reference the termination, the policy changes, or the growing noise around governance. The request was simple, almost disarming. I agreed, surprised by how easily the word yes came out. Her voice was calm, precise, and unhurried. It carried the tone of someone accustomed to waiting rather than persuading. When the call ended, my hands were steady, but my breathing had shifted, shallow in a way I didn't like. Margaret didn't react the way people usually do when something breaks. She didn't challenge her son, she didn't defend the company, she didn't rush toward repair. That restraint was deliberate. In my experience, loud responses chase closure, quiet ones search for truth. I thought about her history as I sat with that silence. Margaret Whitmore had never been associated with a firing, a scandal, or a public dispute. Her name appeared only in trust filings and early corporate records. She had built her legacy by refusing to intervene impulsively, even when she could. Before hanging up, she added one final line, measured and unmistakable. This isn't about the company. The sentence landed heavier than any accusation. If this wasn't about corporate damage or reputation, then whatever she wanted had nothing to do with strategy. It was about people, responsibility, and something older than policy. That realization didn't frighten me, it unsettled me, because I sensed that the ground beneath everything Ryan controlled had begun to shift. The calm carried an unease I couldn't name. A warning that restraint often precedes consequences no one can stop once they begin moving. I met Margaret Whitmore at her home. Not an office, not a boardroom, and certainly not with lawyers waiting nearby. The house was quiet, lived in, ordinary in a way that felt intentional. We sat at a small kitchen table, sunlight cutting across polished wood, and she poured coffee herself. No assistants, no folders. That alone told me this meeting wasn't procedural. She didn't start with my termination. She didn't ask how I was holding up. Instead, she placed an envelope on the table between us and said, "I want to be very clear about why you're here." Inside was a single sheet, a cashier's check, and a number that took a moment to register: $1 million. "There's no contract," she said calmly. "No obligation, no requirement that you return to the company. Now or later." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "This isn't compensation." The tension tightened in my chest. I waited. "My son made a decision," Margaret continued. "It was legal, it was efficient, and it reflected his values, not mine." She met my eyes without flinching. "This money is not an attempt to undo what he did. It's my way of separating myself from it." I studied her face, searching for leverage, for calculation. There was none. She wasn't bargaining. She was stating terms to herself. "I don't fire people," she said. "I never have." When someone is dismissed like that, and I remained silent. Silence becomes agreement. Her voice stayed even. "I won't let that be said of me." That was when I understood. This wasn't a bribe. It wasn't hush money. It wasn't even restitution. It was something rarer. An apology that didn't ask to be accepted. The room felt suddenly smaller. Accepting the money would be easy. Refusing it would be heavier. Either choice would echo beyond this table. Margaret folded her hands and delivered the line without drama. Almost gently, "If you say yes, I'll understand. If you say no," she added, after a careful beat, "I'll respect you more." The words landed hard, sharpening the air between us. There was no pressure in them, only consequence, in that moment. The offer stopped being about money entirely. It became a test of who would carry the weight of what had already been done. I felt the tension settle deeper. Not explosive, but compressed. The kind that warns you a wrong answer will linger longer than silence. Margaret waited without moving, without expectation, allowing the choice to belong fully to me. Outside, a car passed, a reminder the world kept going. Inside that kitchen, time narrowed, and I realized this conversation would define what came next, whether I walked away lighter or carried something heavier with intention. Either way, I would not forget the weight of her quiet offer or its consequences later. I didn't answer immediately. The envelope stayed between us, untouched, like a question that refused to blink. My silence wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. I needed to be sure my response didn't serve my pride more than my principles. "I can't accept this," I said at last. My voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It simply landed. Not because the amount is wrong, but because the reason is. Margaret didn't interrupt. She didn't defend the offer. She waited, giving my words space to exist without negotiation. "If I take the money," I continued, "it turns what happened into a transaction. It suggests that ethical harm can be balanced, settled, and closed with a number." I shook my head once. That's not how this works. Not for me. The pressure I'd been holding finally surfaced, controlled but undeniable. I had spent years insisting that accountability couldn't be optimized away, that values weren't optional when inconvenient. Accepting her check would contradict everything I'd enforced. "And if I come back," I added, "even briefly, even symbolically, it tells people this was fixable, that the decision was merely premature, not wrong." I met her eyes. "It would legitimize a mistake that needs to remain visible." This wasn't about Ryan anymore. He had made his choice. This was about Margaret carrying a burden that wasn't hers to carry. She was offering her own integrity as collateral for someone else's failure, and that felt heavier than any severance package. "You don't owe me this," I said quietly. "And you shouldn't have to apologize for a grown man's values." The room felt tighter. The air compressed by words neither of us rushed to soften. My refusal wasn't defiance. It was protection. I wasn't preserving my dignity alone. I was preserving hers. Margaret studied me for a long moment. No disappointment crossed her face, no frustration. She nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something she'd suspected but never assumed. "Then you're still who I thought you were," she said. The tension didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It became something steadier, heavier with meaning instead of conflict. I stood to leave, knowing the cost of that single word would echo far beyond that kitchen. The $1 million would remain untouched, but the refusal itself had weight, and it would travel forward, quietly reshaping everything that came after. I walked out with no receipt, no signature, no obligation attached to my name. What I carried instead was clarity, sharp and irreversible. Saying no didn't end the conflict, it defined it. From that moment forward, every consequence would belong to those who chose convenience over conscience. I had closed one door without slamming it, and the quiet that followed was not weakness, it was preparation. For everything ahead would move because of that choice, whether they were ready or not. After I walked away from Margaret's kitchen, the company entered a phase it didn't recognize yet. There was no announcement, no memo explaining the absence I left behind. My role simply vanished. And with it, the final mechanism designed to ask whether something should be done, not just whether it could. Ryan Whitmore moved fast. Within days, he unveiled a revised growth strategy, packaged as decisive leadership. He spoke confidently to investors, promising efficiency, velocity, and clarity of execution. He gave interviews that framed recent changes as modernization, dismissing internal controls as legacy friction. The tone was polished, rehearsed, and relentless. Ethics, he implied, were being democratized. Responsibility would be shared. No single voice would slow progress again. At first, it worked. Stock held steady. Applause followed. The board nodded along, relieved by momentum after months of internal tension. But beneath the presentation slides, systems began reacting to stress they were never meant to absorb alone. Decisions I had once stalled resurfaced simultaneously. Risk thresholds were adjusted upward. Documentation requirements loosened. A restructuring initiative Ryan had revived triggered counterparties to request disclosures that no longer existed in complete form. What had once been contained now bled outward, attracting attention that spreadsheets couldn't silence. The first sign of trouble arrived quietly. An external auditor requested clarification on compliance gaps tied to a recent acquisition. Legal responded with assurances. Finance followed with projections. But the questions didn't stop. They multiplied, sharper and more specific, circling decisions I had flagged years earlier. Ryan went on the offensive. He accused critics of resisting innovation. He questioned the motives of reviewers. He leaned into the narrative of disruption under siege. The harder he pushed, the louder the system creaked. Then the audit widened. An independent firm was formally engaged, triggered not by whistleblowing or scandal, but by procedural inconsistencies flagged through routine oversight. The irony was brutal. No one had attacked the company. The system simply noticed its own imbalance. The final detail reached me through a former colleague. Careful with their words. A compliance file I had archived legally, preserved according to policy and retention law, had been accessed by a third party during the review. It wasn't leaked. It wasn't weaponized. It was requested. As I read that message, the anticipation shifted into certainty. The collapse wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be dramatic. It would be methodical, driven by processes Ryan believed he'd outgrown, without a conscience to filter ambition. The company was now answering to mechanisms that didn't negotiate. And they never forgot. I felt no satisfaction watching it unfold. Only a steady resolve. This wasn't revenge, and it wasn't chaos. It was structure reasserting itself, step by step, proving that when judgment is removed, systems don't accelerate forever. They correct. And the correction had already begun without mercy or apology whatsoever. I didn't hear Ryan's voice until the pressure had already started bending him. By then, the satisfaction I felt wasn't joy, but a cool steadiness, the kind that comes from watching patterns repeat exactly as predicted. Ryan Whitmore still believed control was something you declared loudly enough. He blamed teams first, in internal calls. He spoke about misalignment and execution gaps, language designed to scatter responsibility. When that failed, he blamed processes, insisting that legacy safeguards had slowed innovation. "We moved too carefully," he said, as if caution were a flaw instead of a warning. Then came the threats. Legal notices were drafted, never sent, but mentioned often enough to intimidate. Ryan hinted at defamation, at breaches of duty, at consequences for anyone who spoke out of turn. He was searching for resistance he could fight, something visible. What he couldn't fight was absence. Without me, there was no one translating risk into reason, no one framing objections in language the board could absorb. Decisions returned without context, stripped of moral logic, naked and indefensible. The dominoes didn't fall all at once. They tipped slowly, one consequence leaning into the next. A delayed disclosure triggered a partner review. That review exposed a restructuring shortcut. That shortcut forced regulators to ask why oversight had been consolidated upward. Each answer created another question. Ryan responded with confidence, until confidence sounded like repetition. I watched from a distance, neither intervening nor celebrating. The tension tightened as his options narrowed. He tried charm, then urgency, then accusation. Someone set this up. He snapped in a recorded meeting. No one agreed. No one needed to. The board grew quieter. Advisors stopped offering cover. Even allies began choosing their words carefully, aware that alignment no longer guaranteed protection. Ryan noticed the shift but misread its cause. He assumed fear. It was separation. The truth reached him indirectly, the way hard truths usually do. Margaret Whitmore had stepped back. No statements, no defense, no softening calls to investors. She withdrew from every symbolic role that once buffered his image. The family name remained, but its shield did not. When Ryan learned this, the anger sharpened into panic. He had counted on her silence as support. Now it registered as judgment, in one strained exchange. He asked, "Why won't she help?" The answer never came. That was the moment control slipped. Not because systems failed, but because excuses did, with no one left to absorb blame or reinterpret intent. Ryan faced consequences directly. I felt no triumph, only a measured calm. Watching him run out of explanations confirmed what I already knew. Power collapses fastest when it stands alone. It was a quiet ending to his certainty, but not the story. The pressure kept building, unanswered, unresolved, pushing him forward with nowhere left to hide. While I remained still, knowing the reckoning no longer required my presence. Time would finish the rest without witnesses, or mercy eventually anyway. Ryan Whitmore was still the CEO. That fact alone surprised people who expected a dramatic removal or a public collapse. Instead, he remained in place, sitting at the head of meetings, signing statements, and answering questions that no longer softened under his control. What changed was what surrounded him. No one stepped in to explain his decisions anymore. No one reframed his choices as strategy or ambition misunderstood. The quiet translation work I once did, converting ethical risk into executive language, was gone. Ryan spoke plainly now, and plain sounded empty. He answered regulators directly. He faced journalists without filters. When asked why oversight had been centralized, he repeated the same phrase: everything was done within legal bounds. It was true, and it wasn't enough. The follow-up always came. Why remove safeguards? Why ignore prior warnings? Why dissolve independent review? Those questions didn't require emotion. They required explanation. And Ryan had none that held. The media noticed the shift. Headlines changed tone. Articles stopped praising decisiveness and started dissecting consequences. One line appeared repeatedly: Sharp and unforgiving, legally correct, morally vacant. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, and it stuck. I read those words without satisfaction at first. Only recognition. This was the gap I had spent years trying to prevent. Without ethical framing, legality became exposed, brittle under scrutiny. Ryan still defended himself, but every defense sounded like repetition. Each interview narrowed his language further, until all that remained was procedure. Inside the company, meetings grew shorter, advisors spoke carefully, silence replaced reassurance. Ryan asked for loyalty and received compliance instead. That distinction mattered. Compliance doesn't protect you, it documents you. Then came the moment that confirmed everything. During a board session, a senior member requested clarification on a risk assessment tied to the restructuring initiative. Ryan prepared to answer, confident in his process. The board member interrupted and slid a document across the table. It was my report, an ethics analysis I had written years earlier. Flagged, archived, and preserved exactly as required. The board member quoted a paragraph aloud, the room still as the words landed. This decision carries legal defensibility, but introduces long-term reputational exposure without moral mitigation. Ryan recognized it instantly. He didn't argue. He couldn't. The document spoke clearly without my voice attached. No one rescued him. No one reframed the moment. Justice didn't arrive loudly. It arrived as clarity. I felt a quiet satisfaction settle in. Not from his discomfort, but from the system finally reading what it had once ignored. The balance restored itself without spectacle, proving that truth, when preserved, waits patiently until it is needed. Walking away from Whitmore Industries felt lighter than I expected. I didn't look back, didn't wait for apologies, and didn't answer the calls that eventually came. I chose distance, and in that space, something unfamiliar settled in freedom. I didn't return. Not as an employee, not as a consultant quietly absorbed back into the system. Instead, I registered my own practice and began working as an independent governance advisor. Companies reached out cautiously at first, unsure whether I carried resentment. I didn't. I carried clarity. My work wasn't about punishment. It was about structure, boundaries, and teaching organizations how to hear warnings before they became headlines. I helped boards design oversight that couldn't be optimized away. I built review mechanisms that reported sideways, not upward. I trained executives to understand that compliance without conscience only delays damage. The work was slower, quieter, and far more effective. I slept better. I spoke less. I listened more. What I didn't do was interfere with Ryan's collapse. I didn't leak documents. I didn't comment publicly. The system corrected itself without my fingerprints. Consequences moved on their own timeline. And that mattered. Justice felt cleaner when it didn't require my presence. Then came an offer I hadn't expected. A global firm approached me with a senior role, broader authority than I'd ever held before. The title was impressive. The compensation was generous. The influence was real, for a moment. It resembled the power I'd lost. I didn't say yes immediately. I rewrote the terms. I insisted on independent reporting lines, veto authority over ethical breaches, and contractual protection against quiet removals. When they agreed without hesitation, I accepted. Control. This time was mutual. The assent wasn't loud. There were no announcements celebrating my return to prominence. I didn't need them. I had chosen a position where values weren't decorative, where integrity wasn't a department, but a condition of leadership, from a distance. Whitmore Industries continued to exist. Ryan remained CEO, managing outcomes he could no longer reframe. I felt no urge to watch closely. My work had moved beyond him. The calm that followed wasn't emptiness. It was balance. I had stepped out of a system that punished restraint and into one shaped by it. The climb I was making didn't require permission, only patience. For the first time in years, my progress felt unforced. And the quiet around it was not loneliness. It was peace. I understood then that success didn't need witnesses. It needed alignment. Every choice after that felt deliberate, grounded, and sustainable. I wasn't rising to prove anyone wrong. I was building something that couldn't be erased by convenience or fear. That realization stayed with me, steady and reassuring, as my work expanded quietly, shaped by intention rather than reaction. It confirmed restraint could be a powerful form of progress. I wake early now, not from obligation, but choice. Morning light fills my kitchen as coffee brews, steady and unhurried. This is how the story ends, not with spectacle, but with quiet alignment. Ryan Whitmore was never arrested. No cameras waited outside his office. He remained CEO, technically intact, legally insulated, yet something essential never returned. Meetings grew formal, advisors spoke in footnotes. No one volunteered to explain his intentions anymore. Decisions stood alone, stripped of translation, and that isolation changed everything. Ethical isolation is subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It simply removes protection. Ryan learned that the hard way. Every statement he made was taken literally. Every assurance was measured against record. Without someone framing consequence, authority became exposed. Power still fired people. It just couldn't defend itself. I didn't celebrate his discomfort. Justice didn't feel like victory. It felt like balance restored. Systems corrected because they were allowed to. Truth surfaced because it had been preserved. My role in that process ended the moment I chose restraint over retaliation. I sip my coffee and think about how close I came to accepting silence as payment. Saying no didn't punish anyone. It clarified responsibility. It separated my values from someone else's choices. And that separation mattered more than consequence. I still work. I still advise. I still say no when necessary. The difference is where and how. I no longer protect ambition from itself. I protect structure from erosion. That distinction brings peace. There are no regrets in this ending, only clarity. Ryan continues forward, surrounded by process but no conscience buffer. I continue forward, lighter, steadier, unburdened. Nothing about this outcome feels dramatic, but it feels honest, earned through patience, restraint, and the decision to let consequences speak without interference today quietly. Power fires people. Character outlives them. This story reminded me that real justice doesn't always arrive with noise or revenge. Sometimes it shows up quietly, when you choose not to trade your values for comfort. Walking away felt risky, but it taught me something: lasting integrity doesn't protect your position. It protects your future. Power can end a job in seconds, but character keeps working long after titles disappear. How did this story make you feel? Was there a moment or detail that stayed with you longer than the rest? I'd genuinely love to know where you're listening from right now. If this story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments. Tap like, pass it along to someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories keep reaching the right people, reaching the right people, reaching the right people.